Hey everybody, in this video, as I guess you know because you clicked the video, I'm going to be reading a chapter from Robert Ogman's Against the Nation, Anti-National Politics in Germany. The chapter that I'm reading is titled Something Better Than the Nation. Here we go. I'm not going to look up a lot of these terms. Well, I am going to be looking up a lot of these terms, but only the terms that appear, that have not appeared already in my other readings of the book. So, if you want to hear those, you're going to have to go back. I'm sorry. So here we go. While the radical left had brought together diverse perspectives, the radical left organization, radical left is in capital letters, while the radical left had brought together diverse perspectives under a common opposition to political unification and German nationalism, the heterogeneous group did not survive. However, this was only the beginning of anti-national mobilizations, responding to the growing neo-fascist movement, as well as the rightward drift of mainstream political discourse and public policy. A new anti-national formation arose. In 1992, during a wave of racist violence, particularly in the East, a countrywide group of individuals under the name of Wohlfahrtsausschüsse came together under the banner Something Better Than the Nation. Etwas Besseres als die Nation. Let me look this up. WHLFAHRTSAUSS. All right, I found it. It's titled that translates apparently that Wohlfahrtsausschüsse translates to welfare committee. And the German Wikipedia says, since the beginning of the 1990s, several anti-fascist initiatives in large German cities, including Hamburg, Munich, Cologne, Frankfurt am Main, Dusseldorf, have called themselves welfare committees. The initiatives were founded in 1992 as part of the Popcom in Cologne, with unusually strong participation from well-known artists, musicians, and theorists, which subsequently ensured intensive journalistic coverage of the welfare committees. The decisive factor for its founding was the perception that a, quote, barely concealed grand coalition of parliament, neo-Nazi terror, ordinary citizens, police, and media were working together in a cynical interplay to, quote, solve the asylum question, end quote, unquote. One of the largest and first welfare committees was based in Hamburg, where it was publicly introduced in December 1992. Triggered by the pogroms in Hoyerswerda and Rostock-Lichtenhagen, Johann Distelmeier and Schorsch Kamerun, musicians of the Hamburg School, set up a welfare committee in Hamburg. Numerous people from the Hamburg music scene took part in it at times. For example, from bands such as The Absolute Beginners, Blumfeld, Die Goldenen Zitronen, Die Sterne, Kastierte Philosophen, and Captain Kirk and I don't know if that's supposed to be and co or what. It just says Captain Kirk with an ampersand at the end of it. It saw itself as a, quote, ad hoc group of musicians, DJs, artists, authors, and journalists to counter the fascist attacks on migrants, gays, disabled people, leftist, and subcultural context. Quote, the Hamburg Welfare Committee was also responsible for a concert, discussion, and lecture tour through East Germany, Rostock, Leipzig, Dresden, under the title Something Better Than the Nation, which was sometimes heavily criticized by East German leftists. Around 200 people took part in this tour in June 1993. However, the radically anti-fascist participants met with rejection and even disinterest from the East German participants, mainly because they did not adequately take East German specifics into account. An organizer from Rostock described them in retrospect as a, quote, clique of left-wing intellectual West Germans who had embarked on an Enlightenment campaign in the East, end quote. The Cologne Welfare Committee was partly made up of people from the environment of the Spex and Texte zur Kunst editorial offices at the time, and the Cologne Welfare Committee organized the, quote, First Congress for the Defense Against Counter-Revolutionary Evil, end quote, from the 25th to the 27th of June 1993. The first issue of Beute, which was founded in the environment of the welfare committees, was published in 1994. The last issue appeared in 2000. In 1995, a Tübingen welfare committee disrupted the traditional, quote, May singing, end quote, of the local student associations by means of communication guerrilla. When the associations began to sing, images of men's associations such as gymnastic clubs, but also Nazi war criminals and the like were projected onto the collegiate church, accompanied by loud piano music. A new approach was interrupted by a loud, quote, conquest of paradise by Vangelis. Shortly afterwards, naked dancers appeared in front of the collegiate steps carrying, quote, Jesus loves you, end quote, posters and handing out Christian tracts. The confusion caused by the performance led to the gradual dissolution of the event. Okay. So, back to the text. Because of the racial attacks in the cities like Hoyerswerda, Rostock, and Muln, the rapid growth of neo-Nazi organizations, the public frenzy over immigration and asylum, and the passing of the, quote, asylum compromise, Asylum promise, the group decided to intervene in the public realm at both the practical and analytical levels to combat the, quote, right-wing potential in the state and society, end quote. Footnote. Wohlfahrtsausschuss Hamburg, unser Minimalziel in Wohlfahrtsausschüsse, edited volume, etwas Besseres als die Nation, Materialien zur Abwehr des gegenrevolutionären Übels. End footnote. One second. I think I can look this up pretty easily because I think it's in the footnotes. Motherfucker. I don't want to use Google Lens. Ugh. Let me see if anything comes up for this book when I put it in the search engine. No, I can't find anything for it. Anyway, back to the text. They did so by holding semi-public discussions on timely political issues and strategy sessions for civil society groups engaged in anti-racist work. Their major intervention, however, was a caravan of West German musicians, artists, intellectuals, and activists to East Germany in order to support people there who were confronting the radical right in the public space. Additionally, the Wohlfahrtsausschüsse let me try that again. Wohlfahrtsausschüsse coordinated a public demonstration against the passing of the asylum reform by physically blocking the Parliament building in Bonn in 1993. One second. Let's see if there's anything for this. Okay. I want to look up this asylum thing. Asylum. Also me. Oh. Here we are. Here we are. We got a page for the Asylum Compromise. The Asylum Compromise is the name given to the new regulation of asylum law agreed by the CDU/CSU and SPD on the 6th of December 1992 and passed by the German Bundestag on the 26th of May 1993 under the government of Helmut Kohl's fourth cabinet by the coalition government of CDU, CSU, and FDP with the consent of the SPD opposition, required for the two-thirds majority in the Bundestag to amend the Constitution. The amendment of the Basic Law and the Asylum Procedure Act, renamed the Asylum Act, with effect from October 24th of 2015, restricted the possibilities of successfully invoking the fundamental right to asylum. Other components of the Asylum Compromise were the introduction of the Asylum Seekers Benefits Act and the creation of an independent war refugee status. The Asylum Compromise was preceded by the Asylum Debate, one of the sharpest, most polemical, and consequential debates in German post-war history. God damn it. I'm trying to... During the Nazi era, more than 80 countries worldwide took in around 500,000 refugees from Germany. Based on this experience, the Parliamentary Council decided to make a basic right to asylum in Article 16 of the Basic Law. Politically persecuted persons are entitled to asylum. This basic right, Article 16a, Paragraph 1, was not subject to any statutory reservation and can therefore not be restricted by a simple federal law. At first, the number of asylum applications fluctuated but was low. In the mid-1980s, around three-quarters of asylum seekers came from the, quote, Third World. However, the revolutions in 1989, the Yugoslavian wars, and the collapse of the Soviet Union changed this situation. From the end of the 1980s, the number of asylum seekers rose sharply. The governing parties, CDU, CSU, called for an amendment to Article 16 of the Basic Law. The SPD, FDP, and Greens rejected this. The number of asylum applications rose in the early 1990s to 438,000, 191 in 1992, almost three-quarters of which were from Europe. However, the number of newly arrived asylum seekers was lower. At that time, statistics did not yet record who had newly entered the country as an asylum seeker and who was already in the country and had only submitted a second application, follow-up asylum application. The Federal Office for Migration and Refugees has only been making the distinction since 1995. Even though Germany was the main host country for refugees in the EU, the number of asylum seekers did not develop as a German but as a European phenomenon. In the EU, the number of asylum seekers rose from around 160,000 in 1985 to almost 700,000 in 1992. At the beginning of the 1990s, asylum seekers came mainly from Yugoslavia, which was torn apart by civil war. In addition to asylum seekers, there was additional immigration through the family reunification of guest workers and from 1989 by Germans from the former Eastern Bloc, especially Russian Germans. The following table and diagram I'm not going to read that. Problems and public debate. The volume of asylum applications led to a long processing times and increased costs for municipalities for accommodation and care during the asylum process. Large parts of the German population felt that the number of asylum seekers entering the Federal Republic of Germany was too high. In February 1992, according to an EMNID survey, 74% of respondents were in favor of amending the basic law to reduce the number of asylum seekers. The low recognition rate in asylum procedures was discussed under the slogan, quote, asylum abuse. Only 4.25% of applications were actually approved. In many cases, it was not possible to deport asylum seekers who were not recognized as eligible for asylum. This particularly affected Civil War refugees from Yugoslavia. The media also reported on cases in which asylum seekers went into hiding in Germany after the application was rejected. The topic has been controversially discussed repeatedly. The subject of the discussion was, among other things, whether Germany is or wants to be a country of immigration, to what extent immigration represents an enrichment, a multicultural society, a burden or a danger, whether foreign crime poses a threat to internal peace. Supporters of the more restrictive asylum policy were often accused of xenophobia. Right-wing extremists also took up the issue. In 1989, the Republicans, which was like a right-wing party in Germany, were able to gain seats in the Berlin 7.5% and European Parliament 7.1% elections by citing the issue of, quote, asylum abuse. At the same time, xenophobic crimes occurred. Riots in Rostock, Lichtenhagen, and the assassination attempt in Mölln in 1992 were among the most serious of numerous xenophobic acts of violence, which were mainly directed against asylum seekers, accommodation, and their residents. As a reaction from civil society, citizens' movements expressed their solidarity at the victims and those threatened in the form of rallies and candlelight vigils. See Munich Candlelight Vigil. In the course of the discussion about restricting the basic right to asylum, the term, quote, asylum seeker became more widely used in public. Instead of increasingly derogatory term, quote, asylum seeker, In the course of the discussion about restricting the basic right to freedom, the term, quote, asylum seeker became more widely used in public instead of the increasingly derogatory term, quote, asylum seeker, which I guess, as I'm reading this, but this is a translation from German Wikipedia. So, got to be careful here. This new term has been criticized because it relativizes the right to asylum guaranteed by the Constitution. If there is an unconditional right to asylum, asylum applications should be granted, whereas an application can be rejected due to a lack of legal entitlement to the requested recognition. In fact, however, the new term did not change the legal entitlement in any way. The term, quote, asylum seeker entered legal language and is now the official term of people who apply for asylum or are in an ongoing asylum procedure. Critics of the term prefer the term, quote, asylum seeker. In view of the political mood, the FDP and the SPD agreed to a change to the basic right to asylum after highly controversial domestic political discussions, the so-called Petersburg term. In 1993, the asylum law reform achieved through the Asylum Compromise came into force. The compromise rests on several pillars: principles of safe third countries. 1. Principles of safe third countries. Anyone entering Germany from a European Union country or a country classified as a safe third country cannot invoke the basic right to asylum, since according to the will of the legislator, it was already possible to apply for asylum in the safe third country, which means that there is no longer any need to apply for asylum in Germany. Which countries are to be regarded as safe third countries is determined by a law that requires the approval of the Federal Council. Section 26A of the Asylum Act lists the countries currently classified as safe third countries. One problem in practice, however, is that some asylum seekers conceal their route of entry. Despite being rejected as an asylum seeker, an application for recognition as a refugee under the Geneva Refugee Convention, Section 3 of the Asylum Act, or for subsidiary protection, Section 4 of the Asylum Act, is possible. Whether Germany is responsible for examining such applications is determined by the Dublin III regulation. 2. Principle of safe countries of origin. If a person comes from a safe country of origin, it is refutably presumed that there is no persecution. When examining the individual asylum application, the asylum seeker must substantiate significant facts justifying persecution in order for the application to be approved. Safe countries of origin are determined by federal law, which requires the approval of the Federal Council. 3. Airport regulations. Apart from landing by ship on the North and Baltic coasts, entry with asylum entitlement is in fact only possible by plane, as otherwise immigration always takes place via a safe third country. In the airport procedure, an accelerated procedure takes place for asylum applicants who do not present a passport or a fake passport or who come from safe countries of origin. The applicant is heard within 2 days, and then a decision is made as to whether the asylum application is obviously unfounded or whether entry into Germany is permitted. If the asylum application is rejected as obviously unfounded, the applicant is provided with a lawyer at state expense so that urgent legal protection can be applied for before the administrative court. If the administrative court grants the application or does not decide on the application within 14 days, the applicant is allowed to enter Germany. If the court makes a negative decision, the applicant is deported directly from the transit area. 4. Introduction of an independent benefits law for asylum seekers. Granting of benefits outside of social assistance. Significant reduction in benefits. Principle of benefits in kind. Placement in shared accommodation. Asylum Seekers Benefit Act in force since November 1993. 5. Creation of an independent war refugee status to prevent war refugees from being forced into hopeless asylum procedure, residence permit according to Section 32A of the Aliens Act. In order to implement the Asylum Compromise, Article 16, Paragraph 2, Sentence 2 of the Basic Law, quote, politically persecuted persons are entitled to asylum, end quote, was transferred word for word into the new Article 16A of the Basic Law on the 1st of July, 1993. The newly introduced Article 16A, Paragraph 2 of the Basic Law contains the regulation on entry from safe third countries. Furthermore, the asylum procedure, today known as the ASIG, was amended on the 1st of July, 1993. A regulation on safe third countries was issued, the Aliens Act was amended, and the Asylum Seekers Benefit Act was introduced on the 1st of November 1993. Even after it came into force, the amendment to the Basic Law was still controversial. On the 14th of May 1996, the Federal Constitutional Court confirmed the constitutionality of the amendment to the Basic Law and the resulting statutory provisions in 3 judgments. As a result of the Asylum Compromise and the end of the Yugoslavian War, there was a significant decline in asylum applications. In 1995, 166,951 asylum applications were received, of which 127,937 were first-time applications. The number continued to fall until 2008. According to the BAMF, 21,029 first-time asylum applicants were submitted in 2006, but only in 19,164 but only 19,164 in 2007. After that, there was only a slight increase. In 2010, there were 41,332 first-time asylum applications. Of the 30,759 decisions made on asylum applications in 2006, 1,951 were positive. Subsequently, the proportion of applicants recognized as refugees was significantly higher, 7,870 out of 28,572 applications in 2007, and 10,395 out of 48,187 applications in 2010. A study by the Criminology Research Institute of Lower Saxony came to the following conclusion, quote, the reduction in immigration of asylum seekers from over 400,000 in 1992 to around 115,000 in 1996, described above, has led to the social structure of foreigners living in Germany stabilizing in recent years. It is therefore not surprising that the crime rate among foreigners recorded by the police has decreased, since the, quote, import of poverty, end quote, was drastically reduced by the new asylum legislation, end quote. As of December 31st, 2009, the Central Register of Foreigners, AZR, recorded 51,506 people from asylum status. A further 34,460 people were recorded who had been granted a residence permit as asylum seekers. The number of registered people with refugee protection was 67,585. In addition, as of the reference date, 24,839 people were recorded with one of the residence permits issued due to certain deportation bans. The main countries of origin are Turkey, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Iran. Okay, sorry, that was a rather long entry. I thank you for bearing with me. The group's book, Etwas Besseres, this book being the Wohlfahrt Salzusche book, Etwas Besseres als die Nation, Materialien zur Abwehr des gegenrevolutionären Übels, something better than the nation, material against the counter-revolutionary evil, shows an attempt to develop a practical and analytical response to popular nationalism and racism, as well as to the resurgence of the far right. They sought to address the relationship between racism and nationalism, and to show how racism and nationalism's appearances in civil society are connected to the state level and public policy. Like those of the Never Again Germany campaign, the participants in the welfare committees were individuals on the non-parliamentary left. They were social scientists, newspaper and radio journalists, university lecturers, artists, and political activists from multiple West German cities. They described the campaign as having, quote, constituted itself as an ad hoc group of musicians, DJs, artists, authors, and journalists, end quote, which had the goal of countering, quote, the fascist attacks on migrants, gays, the handicapped, leftists, and on the counterculture, end quote. As a strategy of, quote, intervention, the group sought to develop a cultural praxis open to people not directly involved in left political groups, who could counter the far right in various forms. The aim was to empower people who were opposed to the rightward drift, yet had been frightened out of the public realm. The campaign sought to support these individuals in speaking out and contesting the reactionary political developments. Rather than traditional political rallies, the group also sought to intervene on the cultural level, doing so by offering public concerts aimed at supporting a counterculture amongst the youth. Journalists and scholars intervened at the level of public debates in the press, targeting nationalism, right-wing violence, and state policies of social exclusion. The main activities of the Wohlfahrtsausschüsse, the welfare committees were organizing public meetings to discuss the new nationalism and to strategize ways to combat it. A political and cultural tour by West German artists, intellectuals, and social movement actors through East Germany, with concerts, public forums, and leafleting to support anti-fascist initiatives there, and a mass civil disobedience protest aimed at blockading the parliamentary session on the Asylum Compromise, and therefore against the state's ability to select which people will be granted the right to stay in the FRG and which will be compelled to leave. New section, fostering debate and engagement. Participants in the welfare committees, or in the welfare committee, sought to foster public debate, critique, and opposition to the new nationalism. They did so by organizing public forums as well as strategy sessions for people hoping to make their civil society engagement more successful, through theoretical reflection as well as by the development of strategies and improved coordination between initiatives. In December 1992, individuals of the Hamburg-based group of the Welfare Committee circulated an invitation to a meeting for a, quote, initial discussion about how to respond to the wave of racial violence erupting in post-unification Germany. The invitation, with the title, Our Minimum Goal, sought to bring together people to discuss the initiative under the slogan, Something Better Than the Nation. In the short statement, the authors announced their aim as the, quote, symbolic defense of the public and private space against the growing influence of neo-fascist groupings, end quote. This meeting was to provide the opportunity for the, quote, exchange of opinions about the bracket current political, end bracket, situation, the discussion of positions, and the development of perspectives for anti-racist work, end quote. This would, quote, open a forum for different approaches to such a praxis, end quote, and for the, quote, coordination between different groups. One common project proposal was to support initiatives in the former East Germany to combat racial violence in the right wing, where violence and harassment of immigrants and asylum seekers occurred over the course of days with no reported interruption from members of the civil society. More concretely, it proposed to organize a political and cultural tour through Eastern Germany, with the holding of musical concerts and public discussions. These meetings represented some of the first public discussions held by the group in order to analyze and organize against the rightward shift in the immediate post-reunification years. By doing so, they hoped to gain a better understanding of the shifts occurring in the post-1989 FRG, which would enable them to, quote, intervene in political debates taking place in the present and to counter forms of racism they experienced in civil society. With many of the participants being active in cultural fields rather than explicitly political fields, they sought to, quote, connect a subversive practice in cultural as well as political spheres, end quote. This would help get new people involved, those who were, quote, outside a traditional political context, end quote. New section. Etwas Besseres als die Nation. Something better than the nation. In early 1993, the caravan under the title Something Better Than the Nation took place. It brought 250 musicians, intellectuals, and anti-fascist activists through the new federal states in Eastern Germany, playing concerts and holding public discussions with the intention of creating a counterweight to the emergent far-right scene and public mood. They went specifically to cities and places where racial violence had erupted, including Rostock, Dresden, and Leipzig. There they hoped to build connections with and support for people in East Germany, quote, to challenge the right and to confront them publicly, end quote. The tour statement from the Hamburg-based Welfare Committee group described the feeling of deep alienation and powerlessness in observing the racial violence in Germany in early 1993 and expressed the need for both a practical and analytical response to it. They wrote, quote, Germany in the spring of 1993, the closer we look, the stranger it looks back. The only thing left for us to do then is to convert this observation into critique. You are outraged over the pogroms against, quote, foreigners. You want to do something against it, and you stand suddenly in front of a mountain of questions. You want to act concretely with others, and you suddenly realize that you need also to be abstract, to develop and discuss concepts, end quote. The analysis of the nationalist resurgence Welfare Committee Hamburg argued, must take into account the diversity of actors behind it. Armed skinheads have their allies in newspaper columnists. Government officials who seek to employ state measures to prevent the entry of asylum seekers into the country exist side by side with ordinary people who want the state to move swifter on, quote, the asylum question. While the Social Democratic Party's position on the issue comes increasingly closer to that of the conservatives, they wrote, quote, you want to confront the baseball bat-wielding Nazi and realize he has allies in the falutin of your newspaper and on the book market who formulate open or coded justifications, which will be read by many and which you have to rebuke. In the morning news, you hear from the Federal Minister of the Interior. You hear that the Federal Minister of the Interior is calling on the Western and East European states for a, quote, concerted and comprehensive defense strategy against the entry of refugees, end quote. In the bakery, a customer is enraged over the, quote, inaction of the politicians on the asylum question, end quote. Midday, you read in the newspaper, quote, on the asylum question, the Social Democratic Party moved closer to the position of the governing coalition, end quote. And, quote, skinheads in the city of Halle attacked the private homes of Vietnamese with Molotov cocktails, end quote, end quote. Observations like this one meant that the Welfare Committee saw a multiple and heterogeneous set of social actors behind the nationalist resurgence, yet they warned against a personalization of the issue, that is, of limiting one's understanding of nationalism or racism to a problem of distinct individuals, from which society could be freed from as long as those individuals were stopped. They argued that there was a relationship between the different actors, who functioned together in an interactive way. Quote, while the right-wing mob persecuted refugees, Parliament worked feverishly on another means towards the same goal, end quote. There was a, quote, barely hidden broad coalition of Parliament, neo-Nazi terror, normal citizens, police, and the media in a cynical interaction, which were together busy with the, quote, solution to the asylum seeker question, end quote. The welfare committees opposed not only the direct brutal violence of street mobs against non-Germans, but also state measures that limited the latter's rights. The group's practical political engagement involved targeting both of these forms of nationalism. Their objective, they stated, was not merely to mobilize the right-wing mob and to defeat direct physical violence, but also to counter the exclusion of refugees that took other forms. Here they referred to state measures such as the, quote, asylum compromise. They did not seek to impact public policy. If this means that, quote, the brutal methods of neo-Nazis would be replaced by the, quote, cleaner due process of the law, if this means the deportation of refugees, end quote. As we will see below, they therefore directed their opposition towards the state and sought to prevent the passing of the, quote, asylum compromise. Yet, not only did the political right target people with direct physical violence and with the bureaucratic state apparatus, the right also fought on the symbolic level. With, quote, systematic terror, the far right not only seeks the conquest and domination of the streets, public spaces, and bars with the use of baseball bats and firebombs, but they also seek to occupy the, quote, ideological space, end quote, end quote. For this reason, quote, purely praxis-oriented counteractions that miss their mark on the content are weakly grounded, end quote, such as physical confrontations with neo-Nazis, which had developed in the autonomous scene, Autonomen, in the 1980s and continued in the 1990s, and the candlelight memorial marches are, quote, ineffectual and, quote, fatal. Their object must not be limited to neo-Nazis, but to include the broad matrix of social forces that have contributed to the nationalist resurgence in the past years. In the cities the caravan visited, they helped hip-hop and punk rock concerts aimed predominantly at youth. They also circulated flyers with their political analysis, and in Rostock, they hung a plaque on the wall near the site of the attacks on the homes of contract workers and refugees in Rostock in August 1992. The plaque was a concrete effort to bring attention to the history of racial violence in the city and to persuade the population to prevent it from reoccurring. The plaque was inscribed with a call to remember the victims of the National Socialists in Rostock, as well as those of racial violence in 1992. It included the sentence, quote, "These experiences and the historical responsibility of the German people must be kept alive in order to prevent violence and the contempt for mankind from repeating itself," end quote. Shortly afterwards, however, as the group documented, the plaque was anonymously removed. Quote, sorry, where am I? Let's check in the footnote, see if there's anything there. This was symbolic of their tour completely, which they themselves regard as negatively or indifferently received by the population, as well as their left-wing oriented target group. It was even being opposed by leftists during their stop in Leipzig. Andres Anisadeh, a participant of the tour, reported that, although well prepared, with enough people to defend against the neo-Nazi attack and enough journalists to prevent repressive measures by the authorities, the caravan experienced, quote, "infinite indifference," end quote, amongst the population. Let me see. Andres is the name. Andres Fanny's Day is an Austrian journalist. Motherfucker. Andreas Fanisidae. So I think it is actually Andreas. I was right. Born in 1963, is a journalist and is the chief cultural correspondent of the Berlin daily newspaper Taz. Fanisidae was previously its head of the cultural department from October 2007 to August 2024. Fanisidae studied politics and literature in Frankfurt am Main and then worked as a Berlin correspondent for the Swiss weekly newspaper from 2000 to 2007. In the 1990s, Fanisidae worked for the ID Verlag, which since its founding in 1988 has specialized primarily in the, quote, politics of the militant left after 1968, end quote, and the edition ID Archive, for which he became an editor in 1993. Fanisidae edited the publisher's own magazine, Die Beute. Back to the text. While they were able to carry out nearly all of their activities, including the mounting of political posters and the painting of political graffiti in public space, demonstrating through the city center with amplified political speeches, it was all ignored, and after they had left, every remnant of their presence was removed. Quote, "You could graffiti slogans and hang posters on the walls against the abolition of asylum rights unhampered, simply a case for the building cleaners the next day. Even the sound system and the amplified speeches in the city centers gained no attention from the pedestrians scurrying by. Theory discussion in the centers of Eastern subculture? ? The left scene had, with the exception of Leipzig, no interest in it. The concerts in the evenings, what are the musicians blabbing about? Louder, faster, harder," end quote. Andreas Fanisidae. They reported an overwhelming indifference. Quote, It was all in vain. Between friends and enemies, you could not tell the difference, end quote. Without running into neo-Nazis or being confronted by the police, they left with a, quote, crippling impression of emptiness, end quote. The aim of improving the cooperation between initiatives in East and West Germany had, quote, completely failed. The only success lay in the building of a coalition of artists, intellectuals, and political groups to challenge the, quote, repressive national state. This success could be seen in the emergence of an anti-national critique within left-wing social movements, but also for popular audiences through newspapers as well as in music and art. New section, opposing asylum reform. The third significant project of the Wohlfahrtsausschüsse, the Welfare Committee, was directed against the, quote, asylum compromise. The aim was to physically blockade the Parliament building in Bonn through massive civil disobedience to prevent the government from passing the bill on the 26th of May, 1993. In the call for the blockade, the Wohlfahrtsausschüsse, the Welfare Committee, criticized the strong limitations placed on asylum rights through the adoption of Article 16, Paragraph 2. The paragraph read that, quote, asylum is not granted to those who enter from a member state of the European Community or from a third country in which the application of the Geneva Convention is guaranteed, end quote. They argue that the asylum reform prevents any possibility for people to enter Germany by land. An outright rejection of the state to regulate the flow of people across the national border. They wrote about the asylum reform, quote, the only way persecuted people, bracket, could reach asylum in Germany, end bracket, would be to book a non-stop flight to the FRG from the prison's travel agency, bracket, in their country of origin, end bracket. The FRG has pressured mainly Eastern European countries to be their accomplices. They are meant to serve as an external barrier, stopping migrants and refugees heading to Germany, and therefore denying them the same freedom of movement in whose name the GDR was taken down just some years before, end quote. This refusal to accept the state's power to control its border was stated in the following way, quote, the power to decide whether someone is or is not politically persecuted, of who is and who is not in an emergency situation, shall not remain in the hands of political parties in Parliament, end quote. Therefore, the Welfare Committee group in Frankfurt wrote, quote, we oppose every selection criteria which denies residence to people who by either want or need choose to live in this country, end quote. Participants in the attempted blockade of the Parliament building numbered between 3,000 to 4,000 people. The heavy police presence managed to prevent the blockade from stopping the parliamentary session and was only successful in inconveniencing some ministers. As 3 entry points to the Parliament were blocked, many ministers had to arrive by boat or by helicopter. Quote, most ministers learned that what it feels like to have one's, quote, land route, and, quote, blocked, wrote Wolf Wetzel, and continued, quote, the majority of the representatives, bracket, could only access the Parliament building with a boat, end quote, and found this detour humiliating and dishonorable. Instead, they would have wished for a strong police operation, bracket, to uphold, and bracket, their self-evident right of freedom of movement, end quote. Therefore, while the protests had the effect of disrupting the parliamentary session and bringing the issue into the press, it did not manage to prevent the passing of the, quote, asylum compromise. One second. Yeah, I can't find anything for that magazine, The Eyes Wide Shut, that Wolf Wetzel wrote in. Wolf Wetzel, born 1956, is a German author, journalist, and publicist. He is the author of several books and publishes in various media, including Der Freitag, Junge Welt, and Nachdenkseiten. He wrote at Rubicon from its foundation in 2017 until his departure in 2018. Wetzel has also been a deputy board member of Business Crime Control since 2011. Back to the text. Back to the text. Therefore, while the protests had the effect of disrupting the parliamentary session and bringing the issue into the press, it did not manage to prevent the passing of the, quote, asylum compromise. New section, a structural analysis. The Welfare Committee's analysis of nationalism included multiple elements. One of these was their understanding of nationalism as a popular and well-established aspect of society that was affirmed throughout the population, rather than a marginal phenomenon on the edge of society. They based this argument on the fact that the assailants against asylum seekers and contract workers in Rostock, for example, found support in the adult population, such as the crowd of onlookers who cheered and applauded the assaults, sought to prevent police intervention, made similar statements as the rioters, and defended the latter as victims of, quote, foreign domination, Überfremdung. Sorry, I'm looking this up. Überfremdung. Foreign infiltration, or Überfremdung, is a political catchphrase in the German-speaking world that describes the preponderance of foreign and harmful influences on society, culture, nation, or language. In right-wing extremism, the expression is used in connection with xenophobic demands, measures, and goals. In 1993, the expression was voted the German unword of the year. In business, the term refers to the acquisition of large capital shares in a company with the aim of gaining significant influence on its management. Back to the text. In their Against the Folkish Center, one of the participating groups of the welfare committees, the Autonom LUPS Gruppe, expressed this view when they described a society-wide nationalism supported by diverse social actors and with various means, quote, whether arsonists or politicians who speak of, quote, being inundated by foreigners, end quote, whether with combat boots or briefcases, whether in the office, in the administration, in the public services, or on the streets, end quote. Let me see if there's anything to this. Autonoma .u.p.u.s Gruppe. They have a book. Autonom Lupus Gruppe's book has a book, which is titled Fairy Lights and Other Will-o'-the-Wisp, Texts Against Dark Times. Back to the text. According to Autonom Lupus Gruppe, The enormous spike in right-wing crimes, quote, did not need to be committed in spite of the police, the leading Democratic politicians, or the majority of the population, end quote, but rather took place under the protection of the police, public officials, and the majority of the population. They further argued that it is insufficient to physically confront neo-Nazi mobilizations. Instead, a social movement practice must be developed in accordance with the, quote, knowledge and historical experience, end quote, that shows that, quote, racist and Völkisch actions originate in the center of society, end quote, and that they have, quote, their legal basis in state institutions, in the democratic political parties, in the police and judicial system, in the medicinal and cultural thought structures, end quote. This argumentation was expressed in the call out by the Welfare Committee Hamburg for the caravan, quote, something better than the nation, end quote. It stated that racism is not the result of individual racists, but instead based in the social structure of modern society. Quote, racism outrages the most when racism expressed directly from or carried out directly against people. This creates the impression that racism can be fought by fighting racists alone, but the idea, quote, Nazis out equals racism out, end quote, does not work. Believing that racism exists only, quote, through, end quote, individual racists leaves the racist structures of reproduction in modernity unconsidered, end quote. The statements reveal that their view of nationalism was not limited to single marginal actors, but rather they saw it as being part of the social structure. New section, interaction between state and society. Another aspect of the welfare committee's analysis was their multi-actor view of nationalism, which they saw as an interactive dynamic between the levels of state and civil society, where the economy, the state, and the society and the media all play critical roles. In order to understand this dynamic, they argued, one, quote, must always proceed from a structural, current, historical, quote, unity of action, end quote, in which multiple powers participate in and in no way leads back to one single source, end quote. Nationalism could not be understood as a mere ideological tool of manipulative elites. It had a structural existence in capitalist nation-states. Yet nation-states do not in themselves lead towards nationalist or ethnic violence. There are important subjective factors involved. Responding to the concrete political developments of their time, they focused on the relationship between the, quote, media frenzy over asylum and immigration, the physical violence of the population, and the constitutional reform of the asylum law, that is, of state policy. New section, international competition. Another element of the Welfare Committee's analysis of nationalism was the argument that racism and nationalism are not limited to individuals, but rather that, quote, the individual and institutional levels support one another, end quote. This is especially true for societies organized upon a market economy, with a dynamic of, quote, cutthroat competition, end quote. Quote, as in every market-based society, where a permanent cutthroat competition shapes every aspect of life, in Germany, people are daily tested for their real or alleged, quote, weaknesses, based on the reigning standards, to sort them out as inferior competitors, end quote. However, the material opportunities for individuals are dependent not only upon their personal performance, but also upon other forces, particularly the national economy. Under these conditions, a particular dynamic produces hope in wage earners that, quote, their capitalist does good business with them and with others, end quote. So, quote, that they can continue to be wage earners tomorrow, end quote. Footnote. See Günther Jakob, Ich Identität und nationale Identität in Wufartsals Chusa, edited volume, Etwas Besseres als die Nation. Welfare Committee, edited volume, Something Better Than the Nation. Let me look this person up. Günther Jakob, like Gunther Jacob. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for this person. I can't find anything for him. Sorry about that. That is to say, the material advantages and disadvantages are based not solely on the individual, but also on the social structures that gives individuals advantages and disadvantages. But while the nation might be imagined as a, quote, community for collective improvement amongst market actors, it is simultaneously a, quote, hunting ground. They argue, quote, the market subject is bound to the fate of the nation. It is towards this fate that the market subject must relate itself. It is in its framework that it collects its fundamental experiences in the struggle for survival, and that is how it forms its identity. In conflict situations, it must serve the nation, and this is also how it expects protection by the nation. The slogan, Germany for the Germans, does not necessarily mean foreigners out, but above all, Germans first, end quote. The leverages of concrete advantage in this struggle include rights to employment, housing, and social services, amongst others. Quote, the German passport and the, quote, Aliens Act actually determine people's life chances. In March 1993, the Department of Labor issued the binding guideline that persons with a German passport ought to be placed in preference, end quote. The structure of the nation-state and the power of belonging to the collectivity represented by that state means a structural pressure to grab at the advantages offered, especially in times of crisis. They wrote, quote, because being German procures a tangible competitive advantage over, quote, foreigners inside the national realm, it becomes more attractive in times of sluggish conjunctures to publicly identify with the, quote, ethnos, end quote, end quote. Returning to the topic of the political unification and the homogenization of the citizenry, the Welfare Committee wrote that the nation-state unleashes a dynamic that produces, quote, potential racists out of its citizens. This is so as long as the citizens, quote, advance the fiction of a unitary people with a common history of descent and, quote, identity, and strive, despite a heterogeneous reality, toward the realization of a process of homogenization of the citizenry, end quote. Furthermore, quote, in the end, it is claimed that the state border and, quote, ethnic lines are precisely congruent, and the people is not an imaginary community of atomized individuals, but a community of common descent, end quote. because the citizen, quote, must hope in the international assertiveness of his, quote, his, end quote, state, end quote, and that, quote, it retains, quote, global standards, end quote, they wrote. Nationalism is also produced due to international dynamics between competing states on the global market. Therefore, they claimed, quote, racism emerges out of the everyday life of an export nation which participates on the world market, end quote. Günter Jakob. The formation of the Welfare Committee out of a collection of non-parliamentary activists and public intellectuals came as a response to the practical and theoretical urgency to respond to the nationalist resurgence and racist violence as well as the government's, quote, asylum compromise. Intervening in public debates, building a countercurrent to the right wing, the group sought to affect the course of social and political events of the time. Through this engagement, they developed and circulated analyses of the relationship of racism to nationalism and of the dynamic interplay between forces at the level of the state and civil society. Their engagement led them beyond opposition to nationalism and to a position that rejected the nation form as such. In contrast to approaches that see nationalism as inter-ethnic conflict, the Welfare Committee sought to discover the motives behind those who raise, quote, the national question, end quote, at all. For the group, nationalism emerges out of the social structure of capitalist society and the lived reality within nation states. It results not simply from elite strategies of manipulating populations, but also from below, from diverse actors within market societies. Their political protests targeted concrete actors, such as neo-Nazi skinheads, and concrete policies, such as the Aliens Act, yet they strove to connect this with their theoretical orientation that nationalism was a society-wide phenomenon, and did so through their writing. Thank you so much for listening.